I discovered a great strategy for a quiet Friday morning this morning.
Yeah.
Don't turn your work phone on until midday.
Yeah.
Suddenly realized.
Nice
Okay.
relaxed start to the day.
Just going to
Wasn't
share.
intentional.
Okay, well, we'll get started.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about testing and measuring changes. It's all about designing your data, basically. So it's really important in terms of quality improvement, obviously. Talk a bit about tracking improvement through PDSA and also over the whole project. So we'll talk about planning for data collection, testing changes, studying the data, and then building your degree of belief over time. So linking those changes together. So this is where it sits. So people often are familiar with collecting data for research. And if they're not familiar with quality improvement, they will often apply the same rigorous approach. And that's just not feasible or practical or even correct to do in a resource-constrained environment. And you often might find yourself talking to people who are wanting you to be strict like a clinical trial and needing to explain that this is not what we're trying to do. So yeah, in research, what you're trying to do is gather enough data to answer a question authoritatively. So that means you need usually a lot more data for statistical significance. You want to control for confounders so that you can say that the thing you're studying is the thing that's made the difference. So the obvious thing is a clinical trial. And we all know that conducting clinical trials is time-consuming, expensive, and often one trial is not enough anyway. In quality improvement, what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve care on a local or on a regional, even national basis, but we're just trying to get the data to tell us which direction we're going in. We're not getting data that would be an important information that you can then apply in a general principle to other places. And that's what research is. It's taking information here and saying, does this apply to other places? Whereas we know that in quality improvement, there's so many local factors that your data mainly represents what's going on in your local area. So if that's the case, if that's the objective, then you don't really need to collect as much data as you do normally in research paradigm. So there's three types of measures. We all know what outcome measures are and process measures are, but balancing measures are the ones that get forgotten. So I'll come to that in a minute. So the outcome measure is basically where we're going. That means, what is the thing that we want to see improve at the end of the day? The best outcome measure in healthcare is what we call patient-focused outcome measure, which is where we think about what is really valuable to the patient and we try and measure that. So, for example, mortality is probably a pretty important patient-focused outcome. Most patients are concerned about dying, and they want to know what the risk is of dying. So that's an easy, hard outcome measure, and that's why we measure it a lot. But when it comes to sort of healthcare pathways, for example, it can be a bit more difficult to measure the outcome. For example, fractured neck of femur. What is the patient focused outcome measure there? You might think that it would be that the fracture has been fixed in theatre. But actually, to the patient, what's important is not how the fracture is fixed, but if they can get back to their normal life. So a patient-focused outcome measure might be more a case of, time to return to baseline functioning at home, for example. Or if they don't get to baseline, where do they get to? That might be a more patient-focused outcome. But you can see that that's more difficult to measure. It's a longer process. And then how do you measure it? You might need to go and ask the patient, or might need to get them to do some exercises and measure their performance in those exercises. It becomes really difficult, whereas it's easy to measure how many operations we do. So anyway, that's a good way to think about your outcomes. And generally speaking, it's good to choose just one outcome measure for a project, because then it really focuses everybody's attention on what is most important here. But sometimes you have some secondary outcome measures, you have a primary one, and then you have lots of secondary outcome measures. And that's the way a clinical trial is usually designed as well. Process measures are things that come earlier on. So they're things that you're going to hit along the way in order to get to your outcome. So they're good to measure because they give you instant feedback or much quicker feedback, time it takes to get into theatre, what the check X-ray looks like, for example, length of stay. These are all process measures, and they indicate that you're on your way to get the outcome. So somebody who has a long length of stay is going to have a poorer outcome than somebody who goes home quickly, for example. And then balancing measures are the things that we don't want to happen. They're the unintended consequences. And it's important to at least be on the lookout for unintended consequences so that you don't have something of a bad news story that kind of derails your project. So often common balancing measures might be complaints that come through, for example, for example, if you institute special access to diagnostics for cancer, say we prioritize CT scans for people who potentially got cancer, the balancing measure would be the wait time for the people who've not got cancer. Does that go up as a result of prioritizing other patients? And in implementing these measures, we need to use an operational definition. So that is trying to be very precise about what you're measuring, how you measure it, and how you calculate the measure. If it's like a percentage or something, what is the numerator and denominator, for example? So it's good to have an operational definition. We can think of measures in two levels, one at the project level. So overall, what you're trying to achieve, that would be your main outcome measure, for example, your primary outcome measure. And you would put that on your project charter, and it's the thing that you would say whether you succeeded overall or not with. The PDSA level measure, they tend to be a lot more process measures, although there can be some outcome measures in there, but they're going to give you instant feedback as to how each test cycle has performed. So here's a little exercise for you. If you could use the chat, just say what types of and levels of measure do you think are for each of these ones, the first, second, and third. So the first one being rate of occurrence of MRSA per 1,000 patient days. What type and level of measure is that? The second one is % of patient encounters in compliance with hand hygiene procedure. And the third one is number of hand sanitizer stations available. So just use the chat and put down what you think the answers to these ones are. So Catherine's saying the first one is an outcome measure. Second one, a process measure. And Blair thinks the first one's a project level measure. Good. Okay, so we'll show you the answers. Yep, project level outcome measure for the first one. We all got that right. Second one is a process measure, yes. And it's a PDSA level outcome measure. The last one is, again, PDSA level, and it's also a process measure. Sorry, it says there that the second one is a project level process measure. Your changes to improve hand hygiene. Well, it depends, I guess, depends what the project is. If the project is about overall healthcare associated infections, then it's not a project level, is it? But if the project is just to get people to wash their hands, then it probably is, as well as the PDSA level. Yeah. So how would you measure this outcome? Access to healthcare. So it's a very broad thing, but we talk about it a lot, and we have to tell the media, the public, what their access to healthcare is. So how would you measure that? Anybody want to unmute themselves and give some suggestions, or you can put something in the chat.
James, would one measure of access to healthcare, which I think we measure already, which is wait time to first specialist assessment?
Yep. Good example. Yep. Okay. So, yep.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I guess another one might be similar, but you could look at the number of people who actually are able to obtain a GP appointment on their preferred date.
Yep, that's a really good one too. That's a really good one too. So yeah, there are many ways to measure access. So you can look in the diary and say, okay, well, number of days to the third next available appointment. You could say number of minutes from time of appointment to time to see clinician. So that would be, the delay in clinic. You could do a satisfaction survey and just like see, okay, who said good or very good in terms of their access. Then the last one is average daily clinician hours available for appointments. So that's measuring sort of capacity rather than demand versus capacity. There are disadvantages and advantages to all of these. So for example, the first one should be pretty easy to measure. You just kind of look at the diary and work it out. And you could even probably automate that and put it on a dashboard. The second one would be a bit more difficult because it probably requires a lot of manual data collection, or at least a workflow which routinely measures when a patient arrives and then the patient when they eventually see the clinician. Some institutions, they do measure this, but it involves a lot of extra processes or different electronic systems that kind of work it out. The third one, I think probably suffers from bias quite a lot. People who are going to respond to a survey are not a cross-section of everybody who accesses healthcare, and typically the most vulnerable people who suffer the most in terms of access to healthcare are the hardest people to get to in terms of satisfaction scores and surveys, etc. But it is a good sort of thermometer. It's something you can send out time and time again. We do a satisfaction survey, we send it out, and it kind of helps us measure if we've made a little bit of improvement in this area. The last one, again, is probably relatively easy to measure, but probably doesn't actually paint a very doesn't actually paint the picture of what the experience is for the patient who gets referred for an appointment. So yeah. So which of these is a complete operational definition? So the first one is rate of occurrence of MRSA per 1,000 patient days. The second one is the percentage of patient outcome encounters with compliance and hand hygiene procedure. And the last one is number of hand sanitizer stations available. So which, if 1, 2, or 3, which one do you think is the most complete? Just stick your answer in the chat, 1, 2, or 3. Blair says the first one. Number 3, okay. So here's the answers. They're probably, well, first of all, none of them are fully comprehensive, yeah. But probably the first one is the most complete because it's talking about something that's already got a definition, MRSA, that's well defined, and it's easy to measure because you look at the microbiology report and it will tell you if it's MRSA or not. So that is an easy thing to measure. And 1,000 patient days is also a common number that we use, and it's easy to measure again because we just calculate it from the number of patients times the number of beds and bed days that they consume. So, but to improve this definition, you would want to define what you mean by occurrence exactly. Are you talking about just colonization, or are you talking about infection? Are you talking about infection that is clinically relevant or incidental? If you're doing that, how good is your, so say if you're talking about colonization, how good is your screening methods? And what sort of percentage of people are you actually managing to screen? If it's to do with wound infections, how many wounds do we actually swab and routinely check? You know, we probably don't do all of them. So there's improvements to be made to say exactly how you go about collecting that data and measuring it. The second one here has got a lot more sort of questions around it. You know, what exactly is a patient encounter? We can all probably imagine what they're trying to mean by that. You know, it's probably any time that you have face-to-face contact. So we're probably not talking about telephone contact or virtual contact, even though those are actual patient encounters. So we need a bit more definition in there. And then, of course, percentage always needs a numerator and a denominator. So the numerator would involve, you know, probably those who've been compliant with the hand hygiene procedure. So then what is the hand hygiene procedure? Is there a document you can refer to that defines what correct hand hygiene procedure is? And then the last one is a bit woolly because you're not saying exactly where. If you're in a larger area, then of course there's just going to be more hand sanitizer stations available. Does that mean that there's enough? So you might say per square foot, or you might have a determined number per ward. So this ward should have 30, and now you go and count them and see exactly how many there are. So it depends on the area that you're looking at. And yeah, there's some question like, what if the dispenser is empty? Is that a yes or a no? So you can see how you try and pick holes in your operational definitions to make them better. So here's some quick key questions you could ask yourself. You know, what is all the data you need to collect? Like if for a percent, you need to collect stuff for both the numerator and the denominator. Who is responsible for collecting it? How often will you do? And how will you collect the data? So it can be quite complicated, but I think there's a really good rule of thumb is making it as simple as possible. Often people reach for electronic solutions for data collection because they see that as an easy way to automate something or to not have to do manual data collection. But actually for a PDSA cycle, you'll probably find that although it seems more work, it's actually less work in the end doing manual data collection to get just enough information for you to progress your PDSA cycles. I think when it comes to an overall project level outcome measure, you probably want that data collection embedded within normal workflows. And so that usually means that you're going to get it from an electronic source, or you need to create your own data workflow that gets the data you want into an electronic format these days for an ongoing data collection. But yes, so for the PDSA and project level sort of data collection, sometimes paper and pen is the best solution. The other thing that is really good to consider that's often forgotten about is sampling rather than just collecting all the data. So we commonly want all the data for our audit projects, but it's sometimes better just to take a little sample because that's a lot less work. And then there's different ways of sampling. There's random sampling. There is stratified sampling. So you will randomly select within the strata, but you might weight your selection based on the strata. And then there's judgment sampling, which is basically in qualitative analysis would be called purposive sampling, which means basically it's not random at all. You're choosing who you're going to look at or what subjects you're going to look at. And you acknowledge the fact that this introduces selection bias. So when you're planning data collection, you want to establish, you want to establish it. You want to, first of all, what do you want to learn about and improve? And then you want to know what measures will be most helpful for this purpose. But sometimes actually you often start off with the measure and you notice that there is a problem with a particular measure, and then you go back to saying, okay, what does this actually mean? So although it looks linear in the way it's displayed here, it's actually not linear at all in how you determine what you're going to go for in terms of measuring and improving. It's often a cyclical sort of, oh, this looks bad. What does it mean? And then you dig around, you find further problems. And what you're trying to do is trying to get down to the root cause of the problem. So often your measures might be different to what your first look information might be like. And then of course, you're onto the definitions, and you've got to spend a bit of time defining it. And you might even do a little test data collection on a few data points, and then ask the person who was collecting the data, what questions do you have? What is not clear? And that will really improve things. What you don't want to do is get to the middle of a project and realize that your data collection has got a serious flaw in it. And that means that you need to start again. And then, of course, you need to designate who's going to do it. The reason why it's good to bring a team along and designate sort of roles to data collection and stuff is because if you just get one person in, and this is a common mistake that organizations make, they get an audit company to answer a question on a particular improvement thing. The audit company comes in and they do most of the data collection themselves. They go off to, they stand around the corridors, measure stuff. They might go to the analysts and get the data out. They put it all together and then a shiny PowerPoint presentation. And then it falls over in two ways. One, the people you're presenting it to don't believe the data because it's so far from what they imagine the reality to be like, or their own experience. And those people don't appreciate that they probably don't have the whole picture in their own anecdotal experience. But nevertheless, the data is not owned by the people that you're presenting it to. And so they kind of disregard it. They say it doesn't work. It's not reliable. So that's one mistake you get over and you can't get around. So if you get these people to actually be involved in the data collection, they own the data, and they're much less likely to say this is not right. The second problem with standing up there and presenting it all in that format is that often your data collection will actually evolve over time through your projects, and if it's not the people on the ground collecting the data, then they're not going to spot actually where you need to change what data you're collecting. They're not going to spot actually we were measuring this, but that's actually not the real issue. What the real issue is slightly different. We should be measuring this. And so you'll change it on the fly. You'll be in the middle of your project. You say, we need to change the data collection. But an external person is much less close to the culture of the organization and the sort of the nuances of it. So they're more likely to just bash straight through the project with the initial objectives and get to the end and deliver that. And then it's slightly missing the target. So yeah, it's really important to involve the actual people in data collection. So looking at the results when we're thinking about improvement in research, the results are there to be applicable in a generalized fashion to other places, whereas in quality improvement, it's mainly just applicable to your own locality. So you want to make the data as simple as possible for people in your locality to understand it. So that's where run charts come in. Whereas in research, tend to rely on much more on sophisticated statistics and other ways to evaluate the results. So this might be a simple table that somebody collects, and it's difficult to look at just a raw table and say, are we getting better or worse? So this can get turned into a run chart, which is a very simple chart. It's usually got consecutive episodes along the bottom. So it can be individual patients, consecutive patients, or it can be buckets of months. And then you just plot as you go along, and you get a graph that goes up and down like this. In the next lecture, the next module, you get to understand a lot more about how to interpret these run charts and find out if there is a signal coming from them. In research, we usually do just one big test and then report on that hypothesis, whereas in quality improvement, we're trying to do it quickly with just enough data. So rapid sequential testing, that's PDSAs. So we've been through this a bit before in the model for improvement. The test cycles are iterative. They build on top of each other. They get bigger as they go. So the first one, you want to mainly sort of get some information about how you run it and confidence amongst the staff. So that might be one patient. And then the next time you increase it by about 5. So that might be 1 day of patients, which is an easy way to increase your PDSA size. And then you might go 1 week, and then you might go 1 month, or you might do it in geography in terms of location. So a 1 nursing bay, then 1 ward, and then 1 floor. And then once you get the PDSA results back, you need to decide what to do with them. And this flowchart kind of helps you understand that. So the first thing is, did the test go as planned? If it didn't, then your results are uninterpretable and you need to redesign your PDSA. But say it went as planned, what does the data show? It either shows an improvement, or it does not show an improvement, or it's inconclusive. Again, if you look at the inconclusive data, you probably need to go back to the beginning, do the same PDSA cycle, but with a different data technique. Something that shows improvement, that increases your degree of belief that it's going to work. But it's not just you as the improvement practitioner, it's everybody who contributed to this PDSA cycle. It's the people who collected the data, it's the people who did the new things, new ways of working. That is what the gold dust is in terms of PDSA testing. If it does not show an improvement, that's also good, because a failure is just a bit more information to tell you, what is not the way to do it. And being honest about that and sharing it around with people, you'll find that people are actually very balanced in the way they critically appraise stuff, especially if they've been involved with it. You come back with some negative things and say, yeah, that's true, but actually, I learned this about it. So there's usually always positive things to come out of a PDSA test, even if it was a failure. So I'm just going to play this video to you. This chap here is from the IHI. He's done a lot in terms of data collection for improvement. So he's quite a voice of authority on it. I'm just going to share Peter's sound and wave at me if you can't hear him speaking.
When I first learned the frameworks for improvement and how you do it, we talked about really understanding the current system, flow charting processes, doing cause and effect, doing lots of surveys, getting all the information, getting ready. And so I, as I advised people that way and saw what happened, I saw a lot of activity but no improvement. So everybody was doing flow charts and looking at their system and collecting baseline data. And we realized in that, talking to some people, as we worked with some professionals, we see they got antsy with that. What is all this quality improvement thing? Why can't we make something happen? And so we went back and re-looked and rethought Deming's PDSA framework. And he said, why don't we just start running PDSAs right at the beginning? We could do it in parallel if we need to do all these things. And so as we developed the model for improvement, we made that sort of a framework of don't necessarily need all the answers before you get started, and people. And so the whole idea of what cycle can we run by next Tuesday became sort of a mantra as a provocation for people to think differently about the system. It doesn't mean none of those other background things are important, but it means that we can actually get along and begin to learn something right away by starting a PDSA. And for a while that was in IHI's collaboratives and stuff, that was sort of a little mantra for us to get people. It's just a provocation to get people to think very differently about improvement, that we actually could do some improvement next week, even though we don't know that much about the system we're trying to improve. So I think that sort of changed the framework and made the model for improvement different than a lot of other frameworks that were available at the time.
Great, yeah. So just hammering home the point of just trying to do enough. You don't need to do a huge thing. Just a little sort of discussion here. In your work area, what do you think you could do by next Tuesday? What sort of tiny improvement could you do and measure and see if it worked? Has anybody got any ideas? So for me, one thing that I could do is getting some patient feedback in clinic, for example. Now I know we do a lot of patient surveys and stuff like that, but I never actually get any personal feedback from my patients. And I would like some. And one way to do it is by maybe producing some cards which you can give to them at the end of the consultation, and asking them to post some anonymous feedback or something. It might link to an online thing, or it might just simply be a comment card. But just simply asking those questions and getting some feedback, I think, would instantly give me some data to work on. So yeah, that was my idea, Blair.
I often find that sort of question so big, you think, where on earth do I start? And I wonder, even the thought that came to my mind, and I even wonder if this is too big, is, so we're in the dialysis unit and we have people arrive, but there's often, there's a lot of variability from arrival to when the person is actually, when their dialysis actually commences. And by mean commences, I mean blood in the circuit going through the filter. And I guess the other, so there's the variability across patients and individually across days, but also I guess the other issue that I see is delay is time to start in general. And it seems to, it comes back to that time issue. And you might, for example, you were saying, James, looking at getting feedback on how long is somebody waiting once, you know, in clinic to be seen. Yeah, so I'd be interested in other people's comments and thoughts, because I think it's something that we could improve on. I just wonder if it's too big.
Well, I think you have something in there. When you say just starting, you mean like staff starting the day in the unit? You talking about that?
I'm talking about from patient arrival to commencement of their dialysis therapy. So we're focusing on patient time.
Yeah.
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 But your comment about staff starting, that's part of what impacts that.
Yeah.
It's not so much the staff start time, because we all arrive at the same time, but it's what happens from, even for staff, from arrival to what's happening in that time that impacts on the patient's start time. It is quite complex. So I wonder if it's a bit big, but if there's something in there we can I could tease out.
Yeah. So, I mean, staff start times affect the productivity of the rest of the day, and that's known in theatre. So one thing that's measured in theatre is when our theatre briefing starts, just by having a target to start to it, and then measuring your performance against that target, can be the first step to improving productivity. So if you had a stand-up meeting or something that's supposed to happen at a certain time, or something that's supposed to finish by a certain time, like you're supposed to do a handover, but the problem is the handover runs late, and then that means that things run late on in the day. Then can you measure that and then start finding about solutions just to keep things within the time frame that they are, for example. And that might be a place to start, because I think it's multifactorial, the time between patients arriving and patients getting their filter running. There's a lot of factors involved in that. There's lots of external factors as well, which are things that you can't really control very easily. Yeah. But if you started smaller and just think about something that's completely internal, that you have a lot of control over, then you'll find you can probably improve that particular factor a lot quicker.
Great, thank you.
Cool, that's a good example. Thank you very much. So another sort of little exercise. So some of you might know what the Net Promoter Score is. It's a validated tool that came from industry, from commercial industry, is now probably in the last 5 years, maybe a bit longer, started to sort of take hold in healthcare. The question is, you know, if it was a department store, it'd be like, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend or family? It's sometimes it's called the friends and family test. So in healthcare, like it's like, how likely would you recommend us to a family member? Now, of course, that sometimes is a question that's a bit difficult to answer if it's like to do with an acute admission, because, well, no, I'm not going to recommend my nearest and dearest to have a heart attack and come to you. So so you can change the wording slightly. It's like how likely, or how comfortable or how happy would you be? That's it. How happy would you be having one of your family members treated here at this hospital, for example? It's always on a scale of 0 to 10, and it needs to be displayed visually in a scale like that. It can't be a drop down. It's got to be a visual thing, so you can kind of like imagine yourself going along the scale. And it's not presented in colors at all. That would bias people. It's simply presented as a linear scale from 0 to 10. And so you pick it. And then the numbers behind that. So if you pick a 9 or a 10, this means you're a promoter. It means that you've been very satisfied and you are likely to actually actively go and say to somebody else, I had a good experience with this particular thing. You know, you're actually going to volunteer, you're going to go out and tell somebody about it. You're that satisfied. So that's why a 9 or a 10 is a promoter. And so you think, oh, well, 8 might be quite a high score, but 8 is a passive, and so 7. That means that, yeah, you were happy enough, but you're not going to shout from the roof about it. So you're not really going to drive further business or further customers if you're thinking in terms of commercial. You're not going to drive new people to you. So that's why they're passive. And then in the 0 to 6 category are detractors. These are people who've actually had a relatively negative experience. There's in their experience, there might be some positives, but there are also definitely negatives in their experience. And the ones right down the left-hand scale will actually go out of their way to tell you about bad things. So that they might post stuff. They might go and say, oh, you'll never believe such and such. And then the people in the middle might be quiet, but if they're asked about their experience, they'll give you the honest truth. So these are all the detractors, and the way you calculate scores, you simply add up the promoters, you add up the detractors, and you take the detractors away from the promoters, and so you get a number. And that number actually ranges between -100 and +100. Different industries kind of have a median number because some industries are not as popular as others. So, for example, I don't know, if it's a luxury spa, you're gonna be wanting to score very highly because your business is all about experience. And if there's any bad experience in there, then you're going to be worse than the competition. But I know, a funeral services, it's difficult for people to have a really positive experience, even if it's all dealt with well. So they're naturally going to have an NPS that's low. So the NPS is specific to the industry. And so in healthcare, actually, satisfaction scores are actually really quite high usually in healthcare. So most of the time when you're asking patients about their care, you would expect to see an NPS, you know, well inside the positive. But probably what's more important with an NPS is actually the trend over time. So you measure it at baseline, you do something, and you see what the improvement is like. So if you had an objective to increase your net promoter score by 10 points in 1 month, how would you go about measuring it in your areas? You know, and then what cost zero ideas could you test in your areas? What things could you do for free? And then how would you test them? Has anybody got any ideas springing to mind for their particular areas? And if for those who don't work in a clinical area, you just need to think about who your customer is. So if you work in an admin and clerical, your customer might be all the doctors that you support, for example, as well as the patients, but you might not have the access to the patients themselves. Or if you work in, say you're completely removed, say you work in payroll, then definitely your customers are all the employees that you support, for example. But you can use an NPS in any of these areas. Go for it, Blair.
I guess one thing we could look at is satisfaction of looking at those who are from out of town who are doing holiday dialysis and whether they're happy with their visit while they're seeing friends. We often get people who want to come down at short notice for tangihanga or an unwell relative.
So you could implement this Net Promoter Score measurement for that particular group of people that are coming in. And you could either set up an easy Microsoft form to measure it and give them the iPad whilst they're in the unit because they're not doing much else, and get them to score it. You can actually collect this data manually, and sometimes it's more engaging. So if you have these little boxes at the exit of a ward, you can give them a token on the way out, and they can drop the token into one of the boxes. And this might be, you might have 10 slots, and then underneath, hidden, the promoters go into a certain box, the detractors go into another box, and then you can simply count the counters. So there's a real analog manual way that you can also do this. Or you don't even need to count the counters. You can just measure the height of the counters in the box. And then in terms of, okay, so you start to measure it, Blair, what in your areas, what zero cost things could you do to increase that satisfaction?
That's where I was thinking again around when you say zero cost things. So I'm thinking, I guess steps that we could take to minimize delay in terms of arrival, starting and getting away.
Yeah. You could think of like things like that to minimize the time. You could also think about, okay, well, they're always going to have some delay, and therefore you're never going to meet everybody's expectations. Could you make that time more enjoyable somehow?
Yeah.
And cost zero ways of making that enjoyable would be getting staff to come and chat for 5 minutes, something like that, or other things. But you can get really low tech in this area and actually get quite profound results from low tech solutions. And then how can we test them? Well, then you would just measure it during and after the test, change and see if you got a change in your Net Promoter Score. So yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Blair. That brings us to the end of this session. I hope you found it interesting. Are there any questions or anything before we pack up for the day?
One quick question with the Net Promoter Score. I was at a seminar last week where we were looking at, there was a comment made in the context of patient outcome scores, and this was out of King's College in London, and they were saying for the integrated patient outcome score, so the IPOS renal, and the similar POS scores, they've gone to a 5-point Likert scale because they said there's number preference. I noticed you said that you wouldn't have the colors on there, which makes sense. But their comment was anything over 10 for a patient outcome score, you get number preference, and you're not actually, it's the effectiveness of the measure is impaired by having the 10-point scale. I just wonder what your thoughts on that were. Have you heard that?
Yeah, there's always downsides to any measurement tool you have. So people have tried to get around it with a number preference thing by, so in research, an even better way to do it is to just present a line that's exactly 10 centimeters long, and you get them to draw a cross on the line. And you only have one descriptor at the left and one descriptor at the right, and they just put, so that's a visual analog scale. And then you have to measure the distance along, and that's the score, and that's usually out of 100, so millimeters. Of course, that's a lot more time consuming to collect. So the Net Promoter Score is kind of like, it's based on that idea, but makes it a bit more feasible to collect. So yeah, you do introduce some forms of bias. However, the ways to get around that is to collect more information or to collect more data points. The other thing is that is actually a validated tool, the NPS. So if you implement it the way it is implemented, then you are going to get repeatable results. So although it may not have validity from one unit to another, so say you're trying to compare your Net Promoter Score to another renal unit, there's probably no validity. There's no validity in doing that, but there's probably good internal validity with this tool, which means that if you measure it in the same unit now and in the future, you're going to get a sensitive tool that has a relatively small margin of error. So if you see a difference, it's likely to be an actual difference. Good question, thanks. Any other questions? Great, thanks very much for coming along. I hope you have a good Friday. Cheers, bye.
Thanks, James.
Okay.
Thank you.